Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us. We have a really fun one coming up. We have back-to-back Connie Draper presentations. This is going to be fun. The first one is, does the Erg-power always equal to a faster boat? And so Connie Draper has her PhD. She's an applied sports biomechanist. Connie, it's great to have you back. We've had you a couple times, and you've done our level 3 talks for the candidates in level 3. And your stuff just really makes people think about a lot. And so we're blessed to have you with us. Thanks for joining. And why don't you introduce yourself and we'll get started.
Okay, so thank you very much. It's always great to come back to your conferences. Just sort of going through what I've been doing is sort of, I did my sports science degree, mostly interested in technique efficiency and how it makes any type of athletes faster or better in whatever exercise and sport they are doing. Started to work more and more with rowing at the beginning of my career, have worked in other sports like canoeing or swimming as well. However, I got stuck with rowing. Over the last 8+ years now, I've worked independently as a sports science consultant. Before that, I was working for Rowing Australia in Canberra and Sydney, which gave me a really good base of working between, the sport and also all these different types of sport science areas, like how does biomechanics move together well with strength and conditioning as well as physiology, and then applying it to the coaches. So I think that gave me a depth of knowledge. Once I started to spread out and work more independently, I have really enjoyed to apply my knowledge to a very a wider audience. And I think I really started to enjoy working with a lot of the developing athletes, from junior beginners up to under 23, and then moving them up into the senior level. So I've been very thankful also that I've had the chance to work in a lot of different countries and with a lot of different federations now, because it does give you a really wide and open overview that not only one method works. And I guess that is a good lead up into our topic today. Does ergo-power always equals a faster boat? The question we have all the time, it's that love-hate relationship sometimes with the ergometer. However, we do know it's a fantastic tool within that rowing motion. And so yeah, let's have a look how I sort of tackle that topic. And if you have any questions, Chris and I decided that we can ask questions in between. So I'm ready to go. One of your most successful coaches, Mike Tatey, came up with a phrase a few years ago, which I love, and this is that he said, back in the 90s, I believed in ergs, and now I look for boat movers. I think that says it all in the way of how important the ergometer is when you work with really big groups of athletes, and when you have a training environment that has a long winter season as well. However, it also shows very clearly that sometimes our beliefs in our training methods can change, and I think there is no right or wrong about it. It just clearly states that especially that what Mike Tatey says here too is that we come to a point that we don't just can put strong erg pullers into the boat and hope that the boat will go fast. I think we have moved beyond it, and especially the quality of rowing that can come through now in sort of the wider rowing community, because there is more access to rowing now all around the world, really shows that we need to take care of the quality of the stroke. And I guess that's why you know, attend a lot of these rowing seminars as well, to just get a lot of ideas how, you know, new ways or different ways come in that assist you to step up in your coaching or give you new coaching ideas. Just trying to move to the next slide. So I think everyone agrees that the Ergometer has been for many years now a very accurate feedback tool, especially when we want to sort of control rowing intensity. It's a very good training tool, and likes to be used during winter training a lot. But obviously there is a lot to say about the pros and cons of how we use the Ergometer. I just put a few thoughts together, which I sort of came up with when I was in discussion with a lot of coaches. And these are just opinions sort of from coaches from all, like working with all different levels, up from beginners up to seniors. So I just, let's have a quick look through it. So as a training tool, you know, as I said before, it's very accurate feedback tool. It allows precision when it comes to plan your training, and it's fantastic if you want to create a very stable training environment. Yes, you are not dependent like weather-wise from it. The other advantage is, of course, it's a fantastic introduction tool to the sport. Even a couple of weeks ago, I spoke to Gianni Postleone, and he said exactly the same, that he likes the Ergometer to just make people aware what the movement is about. So he puts them on the erg, shows them what the rowing stroke should look like, and then it's much easier for that athlete going into that unstable boat in the unstable condition to actually understand what he is supposed to do there. Yeah, because there are so many more influences once you sit in the boat. On the other side also, we need to make sure that we don't do too much Ergometer in the early phases, because it can also be boring if the sessions are too long, and it can easily reinforce also bad habits. We will come to that a little later. However, on the other hand, if you always put a little like team efforts in, little team races, of course, that especially kids love to have that little challenge against each other, so they know what it's all about. As from a technical point, we would say that the Ergometer is useful to understand the basics components of the rowing technique, and it creates a good understanding of teaching the difference between a good Ergometer technique versus on water technique. Another sort of quote I like to bring in here is also that for example, a Dick Tongs, when he starts with new teams, he often comes in and would say, okay, just so you understand the method I'm after, who weighs 100 kilos in that senior team here? And of course, quite a few athletes would put the hand up. And then the first thing he would say is, you need to be able to move your 100 kilos. Otherwise, I choose the athlete who weighs 90 to 95 kilos, because he can make the boat faster. So again, that comes, it's a different way of saying it, but it fits in well with what Mike Tatey also stated earlier in that presentation here. The other thing, I guess, where we need to be careful with the Ergometer is definitely that the Ergometer is a tool that forgives mistakes. So if For example, we let our athletes allowed to row with a completely wrong sort of technique or with a wrong grip, the erg is very forgiving and the water and the boat is not forgiving. So we need to understand that there is a give or take by utilizing the erg within your rowing environment. So to make sure that not bad habits get sort of be introduced and allowed to stay in the ergometer rowing. And once your athletes go onto the water, you wonder why they can't perform good stroke techniques in the boat. However, to continue as a coaching tool, of course, it's fantastic because once your athletes are on the ergometer, you can look after a big group of athletes. On the other hand, also make sure that you don't use such a high drag factor, yeah, because same thing, if we let our athletes row with too much load, it introduces again a very different way of the rowing stroke, of the heaviness of the stroke. So be specific of what you're trying to achieve. Then the next comment was said by one of the coaches, which I sort of like to put in because it sort of shows a little bit what the erg can do in large training groups, however, shouldn't be too much. So it shouldn't be used as a babysitter. Yeah. So if you are having too many athletes and you've got young rowers and say, okay, one of you has to go on the ergometer, make sure you give them some specific exercises or a training plan to do, and also make sure that they keep the technique in mind and not just say, just go on the ergometer and row, because it's not just always the kilometers that make your athletes to become better rowers. It's really the technique that is behind it. If we think about it also further in gymnastics, where also the technique and the sequence is so important, for them to make incorrect repetitions is sort of fatal, because it takes for one wrong repetition, they always say they need to do 7 correct ones so they can overcome that sort of fault in that technique. And when we say fault, we just mean a minor part of that subsequence within that actual exercise. Okay. The other thing too is that we need to keep in mind that with our ergometer scores we get, you can do that with sort of a not sort of perfect ergometer technique. We all know that the higher you pull the handle and the longer it gives you a higher score. However, athletes need to understand that the ergometer technique is quite different in some ways to the on-water technique, and we come to that. So whatever they are successful with and get by with on the ergometer does not mean it's going to be helpful and assisting boat speed once they go into any crew or boats or single sculls. Last point, and always a little bit controversial, I guess, because there are a lot of different opinions around, is that ergometer as a selection tool, yes, no. I guess it is a fantastic indicator for you to understand about the competitiveness and the fitness of your athlete. However, don't forget that we do sometimes have athletes that are not as strong on the ergometer, and we would lose them. Yeah, so make sure that selection should really happen in the boat as well, because you don't want to miss out on any boat movers. And I guess the best example for that is when you think about the Olympics and the men's single scull. So you had the Greek rower Stefanos winning, you know, with sort of a much slower erg score to the Norwegian Borsch. And you've got so many differences, you know, if you just think about this, the single scullers, where we in general would think these are all fantastic erg pullers, you know, also Olli Seidler, even though he didn't make the final, but it does really show you clearly that you have sometimes good boat movers that are not the strongest erg pullers, and let it be because of their weight, their height, or their absolute strength. So absolute strength and the power they can apply on the erg does not necessarily show you the 100% indicator to about the performance the athletes can bring into the boat. Okay, good. So just keeping going about the differences between ergometer and on-water rowing, I guess we can always use a lot of information that has been made available by Val Kleshnev, who is obviously somebody who has been publishing lots about the differences between ergometer and on-water rowing. Just to summarize it again, I guess we can see the different systems of a stable and ergometer versus on-water rowing. So what's the difference here? So obviously on the ergometer, you always have rowers moving their own body relative to a stable platform, which obviously in the boat is quite different. The rower would move the lighter boat relative to themselves. When we go back to the ergometer, the oar, or in this way, the handle works here as a type 1 level, so the pivot point is in the middle, versus on the proper oar, obviously where we hold the handle and the oar is connected through the oarlock or gate. So that's where the oar works as a level 2 type point lever, and the pivot point is on the end, okay, where the blade is. So when you then look into the resistance where that all works, so on the ergometer, if you think about that movement of the ergometer, there are very interesting parts, and that's the area that always interests me when I work with athletes. And this is when you think of the ergometer movement versus the on-water rowing movement, think about it this way. Leg drive is in both movements linear. So that length and the movement and the push through the stretcher is pretty much the same of the legs. However, the moment we come into the handle pull and body swing, then we have huge differences between the ergometer and the on-water rowing. On the ergometer, handle pull and body swing is transitional, so in one direction, okay? So just linear pretty much, if you look at that from the front. Once we go into the boat, then we have obviously two different motions. One is a sculling motion, so body, same thing, moves in a linear direction, of course, pivoting and rotating through that hip joint. But we do that on the ergometer as well. However, now we come to the handle pull, and this is a huge difference. This is now rotational, okay? So you're actually not just going forward, backwards, you need to reach out and rotate your handle around the gate. So that actually makes it quite a different movement. And the distance you have to cover to row long on the in the boat is actually slightly longer than what you would do on the ergometer. So that's the thing when we come out of winter training, where we often did a lot of work, the distance and your sequencing you do between legs, body, and arms is actually then a shorter distance from the catch throughout to the finish than what you do, for example, in sculling, because moving around the pin to be, sort of to get the work done over the stroke actually requires a longer arc. So that means that the sequence now between leg, body, and now to the arm draw is actually slightly different, because you have to move your arms longer and rotate them now around that oarlock. So you need a little bit within the same time. When we think of stroke rate 20, for example, you actually need to cover a little bit more distance to really get to that catch connection and that finish position you are after. So that's a big difference. If you now go further to sweep, that's even different to the ergometer as well. Now we have also the body swing not just being symmetrical, because it's rotating to one side. Yeah, so it's also a rotation around the hip, not just in the pitch direction, also around that pivot. So we have a asymmetrical movement now with the body as well as with the handle. So this makes that sequencing motion to a linear ergometer motion quite different. In general, good rowers can sort of not think about it too much, but we need to, or I always like to point that out, because it does sometimes help that you sort of reinforce to remind the athletes that there is a difference of the technique you're applying on the ergometer versus on the water. And that maybe also helps them to look a little bit more of, connection and precision when they sort of approach that next catch, or when they come towards that next drive phase. Okay. Last thing too here is, when we look at ergometer times versus on water times, we also know that there is a big difference also. So the ergometer times are quicker, but the reason for that is also that we have here a different way of loading. So on the stretcher, on the handle force, we have very similar magnitudes. When we come into the stretcher and handle force application on the water, then obviously we use our rigging component to get the gearing right for loading the oar in the boat and then in the water. So the actual oarlock force matches the stretcher force. However, through the ratio, we actually have approximately 30% smaller handle force, due to that rigging factor. That's also something we always need to keep in mind. When you look at then how that 30% differs in checking it against the force profiles, then you would see here, for example, just the same athlete in these two different scenarios. The force profiles don't match that actually athlete. The top one graph you can see I took out of Wells' book as a reference, and but I like the way how he has presented here the different ergometers. So we see that the actual force stroke length profile here shows for the three ergometers a very similar force profile pattern. However, the boat, you can see it's actually that 30%, sort of less force on the handle. And you can also see there's a slightly different way how that athlete would perform the actual stroke to throughout that stroke length from the catch through the finish. Yeah, it's a bit more of a wide, like less peaky, reaching less peak force, but holding that peak 30% of maximum force, trying to hold that longer, especially in the single scull boat. Yeah, an athlete in a single scull, for example, would look like that. So we have here somebody who's very even now on water boat. We have two profiles here because obviously you have a port and starboard side to represent their force application from the catch throughout the dry phase towards the finish. And you have the reference where they are by looking at the position and the degree of where the athlete is in relation to the boat. Yeah, so 0 degrees would mean your blade is square off to the boat, or 90 degrees to the boat. Anything that go towards that negative angle of minus 60 degrees would mean you come towards the catch, so to your minimum angle. Anything, so here you go through the dry phase towards that finish angle, which should be in sculling around 42 to 45 degrees. And there's no real difference between the different boat classes, from lightweight up to heavyweight rowing. So, but you can really see the representation between the ergometer and the on-water force angle or force length profile is the same. So that's very good to compare information to each other, just a bit different the way how we row. Okay, then when we go to the next point, then obviously here Val has got the C2, the in this case still the row perfect, the older version, and the boat force profile displayed here as well. But the important thing is also the differences in the movement patterns of the athlete. So the sequencing of the leg drive velocity or leg velocity, yeah, or seat velocity, whatever you want to call it, the trunk velocity and also the arm velocity. And I just wanted to show you the differences here because it's easier to see. So if we go back to what we said just before, handle velocity again, we can see that the profiles of the athletes on the ergometer versus the boat can be pretty similar. However, we have to keep in mind, as I said before, that we have 30% less force or magnitude on the handle than on the ergometer. But also with the peak forces, obviously is quite a big difference. Val came up here with 34 to 40% differences he found in max forces. Of course, there is that range that depends on the athlete and also the device you are measuring the forces with, but we are pretty much in that right range there. Here, the ergometer differences, you know, we always say around 30% with all the athletes he tested at that point. He came more up that there are differences of 25% higher average forces on the ergometer. But the next 2 points are the one that interest me a lot. And this is on water rowing. We have wider profiles, force profiles. So you're spreading your work over the stroke more. And that sort of also is because obviously you're moving in a slower environment. So you're moving through the water, yeah, through liquid. So you have to really efficiently move the handle with the right sequence and technique to really get the work done per stroke. And you can also see a little bit that there is an earlier peak force on water than it often is on the ergometer. Okay. The next thing, and that's the interesting one here now, handle velocity. So you see the black line is the on water profile. So pretty much when we talk about on water, it starts with a hang and then you accelerate through. So this is what you see here in that profile, that the speed, sort of where it hesitates initially, that's a hang, that's where the legs do the work, and then the body starts opening and then the arm draw really comes in. So this is quite a bit different to what we see on the ergometer. Okay, so the ergometer handle speed comes up a bit quicker. This is where I said that we need to make sure that our athletes understand that an ergometer technique is a bit different to the on-water technique. You also see when you go to the next graph, which shows you the leg velocity or seat velocity, whatever is easier for you to visualize, that the seat in the boat, again, it's a thicker black line. You can see that there is the magnitude of the seat is a little slower in moving. Again, we need to actually move with the speed of the boat, okay? And you can see that off the ergometer, you can actually, push off quite quickly. So again, the movement pattern of how that leg speed on the ergometer works versus the on water speed for initiating your leg drive can be quite different again. Yeah, so we need to really keep that in mind, that there is not 100% transference of ergometer technique into the water. And that gives you also the leeway for your athletes to sometimes find someone where you think, oh, it's just not happening on the ergometer, and they can actually surprise you quite a bit once they hop into the boat. Okay. However, when you look at the movement and the sequencing of the rowing stroke profile from the side, you could say that in general, it's similar, between the ergometer and the on water. In either scenario, we are starting to move the leg drive first, connecting it with a body swing and bringing the arm drive in. Okay, so that sequencing is highly important. However, here again, this is an example of a single scull. We think, for example, sculling is symmetrical, but even with the crossover reaching forward, we do see differences, that our athletes are longer coming often out on the left-hand side or the starboard side than they do on the right-hand side. It's very common. 3 degrees is not a problem. If it becomes sort of 6+ degrees, it is a big difference. I also see that a lot of, for example, sweep rowers, where we have that rotational movement, as we mentioned before, they are have such an ingrained technique where they set their shoulders that once they go on the ergometer, you often see that one shoulder comes a bit more forward and higher than the other one. So even when they are on the ergometer, try to teach our athletes that they are a bit more symmetrical in the way they set themselves up. All these little fine-tuning, not drills, but advices really helps them to get a good technique ingrained that will assist them going onto the water and be able to row with a good, effective technique in any weather conditions. And we know that's the one thing in rowing, we cannot plan for conditions, but we need to be able to row every condition. But the better and the more robust our technique is, the easier it will be for the athletes to adjust into any kind of boat and also to any kind of conditions. So the one thing here I always like to point out is that for us is pretty clear: erg, sculling, simular movement, symmetrical, leg, body, arm drive, all pretty much the same. Let me do this graph first. However, once you come into the sweep boat, where we said that not just the arms start now or to rotate, that we also rotate the body, then this rowing profile between athletes can be very different. And here's a good example of two athletes out of a successful men's four boat. And you see one message from the coach: they would have done the same work on the ergometer, they listen to the same coaching advice, they know how the sequencing should work in rowing. And you see here two totally different force profiles. They are successful with it, but there's definitely a difference how either of them works through the stroke. So the one person in the in red, you can see the rate of force application at the beginning of the stroke is much higher. So coming towards the catch is also he connects really well with the legs. And this is somebody who has actually also broken a few records in his boat category, versus the other one who is a really good boat mover and can feel and move with the team. However, erg score isn't good, and because of the lack of rate of force development, with, you can see here the few different technical little weaknesses he has to overcome, and what looks here as glitches often emphasizes that somebody sort of lifts into the shoulder or lifts the body up too much. This technical little weaknesses then often occur in less power, less work per stroke, and they also would have a similar technique on the ergometer, with sort of doing less work at the beginning through the legs. And this means that this athlete needs to work on a much better way of sequencing towards the catch and trying to learn to suspend better. So how do we do that? This is something hard to do often in the boat. So I just have a little exercise here, which for junior development is often great. You know, when we have ergometers, you have little tools of how to, where athletes can monitor and their, you know, force profile or the work they do within the session. But here, that is one of the advantages where the ergometer can assist to bring our athletes from a good athlete and a good ergometer rower also to become a good on-water rower. That exercise here, I hope you can see that blue band. That is a good exercise to make our athlete feel what a good suspension should look like. The good thing is you could hold the handle, you could use a band, but when the athlete quickly tries to lift up and hold the position, they actually really can feel what you want to teach them about suspension and working through the legs initially. So this is something that's much harder to try to teach on the individual basis with your athlete. So this is a definitely pro where the erg can assist you in the development of your athlete. Coming now to the next graph, where we come to that point again to say, would our fastest on-water rowers also be the fastest or in the top erg rowers? So what I always like to present is that graph where we look at 4 aides from a collegiate rowing program, all did sort of race pace work. You see here 8 force profiles of a lightweight women's aid, here open women's aid, then lightweight men, and then heavy men's aid. So you see the profiles within the crew vary quite a bit, as I mentioned. I showed you that on the graph before. But there is a clear indication and trend of what changes once you go from one category to the other. The stroke length gets longer with an increase of from lightweight rowing up to heavyweight rowing. I mean, it's clear you get taller athletes. Also the force and work and power per stroke increases. Makes sense as well. A increase of body weight, then better leverage. Taller athletes help that obviously, and then gender-wise, coming from women to men obviously also brings a higher power output once we go into the men's category. But also the rate of force development increases and gets steeper with the both categories. Again, makes sense because men can increase or can produce or apply more force, but they can also initiate force much quicker. When you then look into the international top 10 erg rowers, and we look at their on-water performance, obviously some are more in the sculling program, others are more in rowing sweep. But what you see here is what makes sort of successful on-water rowers, and where does that match with the ergometer rowing? One thing is very clear, and this is that the athletes who are very successful, have the ability to row long. And not just rowing long, they are rowing effective stroke length, so they come towards the catch and connect. The other thing that's very obvious is that the rate of force development is quite steep in any of the successful international rowers. So what we can clearly show is that the rowers who are top in the ergometers have a natural understanding and also subconscious understanding that the sequencing from coming towards the recovery, towards the next catch, needs to be well fine-tuned to be able to connect with the water while starting to push through the legs, because we see really clearly that all of our top rowers really have a good understanding how to utilize their leg drive early and in good coordination and timing with the water placement. Because what we see in sort of the developing athlete is one of the biggest problems with most of our athletes is finding the right connection around the catch. And that's where the legs start already working before the blades in the water, so they lose a lot of leg drive. You even see that here with the heavy men's boat. So this is where a lot of power goes, a lot of crew synchronicity goes, and that harmony between them, because this is a real skill to have. So once athletes can have a good way of moving the ergometer and moving a boat, in, I would say, 90, more than 95, if not 98+% would be athletes that have that total understanding of how to connect between blade placement and leg push and really drive through the legs. So that exercise I just showed you before would be very also crucial if we want to teach our athletes to move successfully from one device, in this case off-water device, into the water, yeah, or better onto the water.
Connie,
yeah. Time.
You asked me to remind you when we're 45 minutes in, so we are currently 45 minutes in.
I'm actually pretty good now with time. I'm quite happy, so thank you. So the last few things I sort of would like to say here before you maybe have some questions is that we come to that point that we say biomechanical differences between the two, you know, scenarios. So obviously, yes, there are some. If we start with the ergometer, the foot stretcher force profiles move considerably more at the beginning of the stroke on the ergometer. The main work gets done through the legs on the ergometer, and now it becomes interesting to, if we want to do the same on the water, can only happen if we coordinate that precisely with the blade placement, because that's our lever, the lock-in. Yeah, if the blade is locked, you can utilize the leg drive that you've been training on the ergometer and utilize it now on the water. If the blade is not in, you're pushing into the air. Okay, so this is a huge difference on when you want to say, are the good erg movers good on water rowers? To a high percentage, yes, but without the blade in and without understanding that a leg push on the water cannot be a vertical push, needs to be a more horizontal connection and push, then the differences can be actually quite small between these two scenarios. But there are definitely people like the Greek scholar who have shown us, luckily, that technique can bring you a long way, and lighter rowers or smaller rowers should never give up if they don't achieve sort of the top results on the ergometer. If they have a good feeling in the way of how to connect with the water and utilize that stroke from the beginning effectively by utilizing the biggest muscle groups, the legs, they can make a boat move really well. So this is where I guess I like to stop for questions now, and if there is time, we can always talk a bit more about you know, other scenarios.
Well, we do have two questions in right here so far. What do you consider an appropriate C2 drag factor for middle school athletes, for the younger athletes, and then even through high school? Could you speak to adjusting the drag factor over time as fitness and maturity grows?
I'm not the biggest expert on setting the drag factors, I have to admit, because I haven't done enough work on the ergometers. What erg factor is the coach using currently? Is it?
The person was anonymous, so
Okay.
If that person wants to actually write in a little bit more, I think they were just looking, that person was just looking for rules of thumb.
Yeah.
But I have some charts that I can send. If you reach out to me, whomever that is, if you reach out to me, I will share some stuff with you that we utilize with our kids at our club.
Yeah, that would be nice that it comes more from the coach, because it's also, even between the different countries, they use very different like drag factors. Some sit on that 3, some sit on the 4. There is a big talk always that, who was it? Rob Waddell apparently did one of his fastest ever times on a drag factor between 1 or 2. So quite interesting, the sort of the different ways that are approached internationally. So it used to be that I was always thinking it has to be around 3 to 4, but then obviously once I opened up to work with different countries, now it's a little bit all over. Yeah. So
yeah, I definitely, we see a lot of people who
you can help me there with the guidance, and I would be interested to what you recommend for that age group.
And so I'll send you some stuff as well, Connie. And we also have found that there are a lot of athletes, like as you're saying, that are just really comfortable at putting it higher or lower, and when it comes down to it, as long as it's safe and for their bodies, and they, some people are able to accept that. Changing it from 3 to 4 or 5, and if it works for them, I'm certainly not getting in the way of it. Do you feel there are erg score levels which are simply not fast enough for both college-age women and men, where the person will be ineffective to perform the needed skills or power production on the water?
Say that again from the beginning.
Do you feel there are erg scores or erg score levels which are simply not fast or strong enough for both college-aged men and women, where the person will be ineffective to perform the needed skills or power production on the water?
That's a good question. I think the scale of what you are setting for colleges in the US is much higher than, for example, what you would see in other continents. Yeah. So when you, for example, when I always hear what the Ivy League schools want with under 6 minutes, or Washington, isn't it around 5:55 or something? Interestingly, a lot of international athletes wouldn't be able to do that, however, can still win medals. So again, I guess it's another one where I can't give you a black or white answer. Your scores that you are setting here in the US are definitely higher in comparison to, for example, Europe. It is in other countries totally irrelevant to work of erg scores. They are not interested in that at all. For example, that Stephanos, that Greek scholar, I think he's 5'55" with 85 kilos and 90 kilos, I think he's now, and 85 centimeters tall. So you wouldn't think that he would be very competitive. So you wouldn't even be looked at maybe at some of your college programs, but he won the Olympic medal now. So I also can talk from quite a few young athletes who find it very hard, for example, junior men, sort of that lighter, like too heavy to be a lightweight and too light to be a good erg puller in the heavyweight program. For them, they come in with around a 5:30, are quite successful racing internationally in the school programs, within the US and the Canadian programs, and wouldn't get scholarships because they look like they are not strong enough on the ergs. So that's always my, it's a bit controversial for me how we actually find the best way to assess athletes if they are, good for your program. So you really want to use them, because I've seen a lot of good on-water rowers who just purely cannot represent their performance on the ergometer. So what it is, I can't answer that fully. It's again a gray area. Again, that's maybe you maybe have thresholds that represent better what you are looking for in erg scores, but once you go outside of the US and Canada, erg scores are not that meaningful. So it becomes quite interesting how you utilize them. It's a good indicator, but personally, I haven't got enough data of especially junior and school rowers that I can give you the exact numbers of what you want to go into that next level of high school and up.
It is interesting because I think the dependence on the erg, or the over dependence in our minds in America, is part of our culture, right? And it's become sort of a metric, like colleges want SAT scores and ACT scores. Yeah. And again, it's a number that doesn't really tell you a whole lot. I remember Mike Spratkin spoke at the Jim Joy conference one year, and I gave him a ride to the airport. We were about an hour and a half early because he did not want to be late. So we were very early. We were having lunch and we were talking about erg scores. And you know how he gets that little grin to him. And he said, he was coaching Canada at the time. And he said, only one of my boys would have made the American 8. And then the other part of it was, but his 8 won. So if we went by erg scores, one Canadian would have made the American 8, but the Canadian, they beat the American 8 on the water. Yeah. So, I think we get caught up quite a bit in the erg scores. And the skill of rowing and moving the boat is entirely different. Everybody gets frustrated when our colleges choose Europeans with less erg scores. There's a reason why they're choosing the Europeans, right? I mean, obviously they know, the college coach that's choosing the European 19-year-olds knows what they can do to move the boat. So it's I think it's a uniquely American thing with this erg. Yeah. It'll be interesting with Yossi. He's going to bring with him a very fresh perspective about moving boats from Europe. By the way, he's on this talk, so before we get too far into what Yossi thinks or might do or say, he's listening right now. But it'll be interesting to have a European perspective to selection and what moves a boat, and how it'd be nice to, I think, maybe to have big ergs. If you can get them to apply the force better, then that's a good thing to have the ergs, right? If you can lock into that power and make it work.
Yeah, I mean, it's as you said, it's when I came out with my more single-minded understanding of, good rowing technique, good erg technique from Australia, I had the erg scores of the Australian different weight categories in my head. Yeah. So then the moment I spread out and have worked with different federations and different groups, from school up to senior rowing, then suddenly it all becomes a bit blurry because, as we said, the drag factor gets set differently sometimes between athletes. We do know that sometimes the ergs can also measure slightly differently. So that's why with that indoor rowing competition becoming so big, which is fantastic, there is also a point, how can we make sure that we know that the ergs are in some ways calibrated similarly. Yeah, so it's all these little questions. So that brought me from sometimes a black and white answer to a bit more of a gray zone answer, because the approaches internationally are very different. So that's why for me it's fantastic that, you know, in sort of in a discussion like that, also get your understanding and see the belief of what, for example, in the US, the levels and thresholds you are looking at for the different categories, because that is completely different in other countries. Yeah, I mean, that's where you definitely have got all the experience and knowledge and the numbers, especially, to sort of set your thresholds of what you expect from different levels. But again, we have to make sure that especially our growing athletes, you know, the pathway athletes, that they also understand the drag doesn't have to be moved up and up and up all the time, because even though it feels heavy and young boys feel like, you know, they can really show off what they can do, in some ways it promotes the wrong sequence, because it promotes a heavy leg drive, forceful, not powerful. Yeah, so we actually train that sequence under a too heavy load would become a very slow leg drive over time. Yeah, and feeling the load, and it brings a lot of lifting. So again, it's important that it's fine to use the erg, but be also careful that we are not uploading it too much, for injury reasons, but also to actually get that lightness of our sequence going, so the transfer from ergometer to on water is easier for our athletes from season to season, but also when they come from beginner going into boats. Yep.
Speaking of beginners, you brought up a really good point in the beginning, is that many times in the last 27 years of coaching kids, you know, I've come across where people start resenting the sport because they hate and fear the erg, because the erg to them represents failure to them, or what, you know, their frustration. And we don't do a good enough job, I think, articulating that the erg is just a tool. We use it. It shouldn't use us. And so the pressure on the erg, the pressure that surrounds the erg in our psyche, I think, is something that we need to do a better job, especially with early pathway athletes and young people. You know, you're not mad at the basketball. You know, you're not mad at your bike. Why would you be mad at the erg? And so we place a different importance on the erg, and maybe we should you know, how many of our people, when they graduate high school, ever row again? And there's probably a lot of factors, yeah. But we need to rethink that, because it's a lifelong sport. We shouldn't be losing people because they don't like the training part of it. So, Connie, I am so sorry to cut you short. I mean, we've gone over the hour, and I know that you and I have another one to do in just a few minutes. Yeah, it's 1:35 now. So thank you everybody for joining us. And Connie, as always, great stuff. Great conversation. I feel like we've just opened the door to this conversation to much, much more. So pretty stoked. And we'll get on over and we'll load the next presentation. The question is, from one question that was early on, is, can everybody have access to the presentation?
Yeah, I sent it through once we finish here straight away. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll get that loaded up to you, everybody. You'll be able to go into sketch.com and you'll find it there loaded up next to Connie's presentation and her name. So off to the next one, and last one, best one. We'll do the next one next. So thank you, everyone.